Hello everyone, this is James Shore with Let's Code Test-Driven JavaScript. You're watching The Lab, which is where we explore, experiment, and generally mess about. And this month in Lab, we're looking at AngularJS, the front-end framework. This is a very, very popular tool, and I'm excited to take a look at it. As with our React review, we're going to do this in two parts. This month, we're going to look at the basics. How do we get AngularJS up and running, and so forth. And then next month, we'll look at design and architecture. First thing we're going to do is look at the challenge. We're going to solve the same problem we solved as for the React review. This will give you a chance to compare the two if you've watched the React review. Then we'll take a look at controllers and directives. Controllers and directives are two sort of core concepts in Angular. Then we'll look at modularity and testing, and then wrap up with a look at how it all fits together and our first impressions. There's a lot of content here. AngularJS is a big, complicated framework, and we spend a lot of time really digging into it. So strap in. You can use the timestamps here to jump to sections of interest. And as always, the source code is available here at the link on your screen. So thanks for joining me, and welcome to the lab. As with our React review, my approach to looking at any front-end framework is a little bit unusual. Rather than looking at performance or the size of the download or anything like that, which you can find pretty much anywhere online, what we're going to be looking at is the sorts of things that I particularly care about with any library or framework. How maintainable is it? How easy is it going to be to use over the long term, rather than just how easy it is to get up and running? And of course, we're also interested in how much support it has for the kinds of things that we want to do. Now, I have several things that I'm specifically interested in with front-end frameworks. I see several pitfalls with these. The first of these is lock-in. If we spend a lot of time developing front end in this tool, will we be stuck with this tool? When we need to switch to a different tool, how hard will that be? When we need to upgrade, how hard will that be? Second is opinionated architecture. If lock-in is about not being able to switch, opinionated architecture is about not being able to build the software the way that is most appropriate for my application. For a lot of people, opinionated architecture is considered to be a good thing. The value of a framework is that it tells them how to develop their app. But my experience is that although that's really nice in the beginning, as your application develops, you learn more and more about what it needs, and that often diverges from what's prepackaged in a framework. So how opinionated is the architecture? How much does AngularJS require us to do things its way rather than our own? Third, accidental complexity. Does the framework introduce a lot of just funky terms and hoops that you have to jump through in order to do stuff that's off the beaten path? Fourth, testability. Testability, of course, is always a concern for us here in Let's Code Test-Driven JavaScript. And if a library or framework isn't designed for testability, then it can often be very difficult to test. And then finally, a particular bugaboo for a lot of front-end tools, search engine incompatibility. Is the framework or library compatible with search engines? Now, some search engines these days do run JavaScript, so you can expect them to index code or pages that have JavaScript on them. But from what I hear, that indexing still takes a long time. It's not very reliable. It can lag your regular indexing by a couple of days, and I wouldn't count on it yet. So is it possible to serve static HTML that a search engine can index? This is an important question when you're looking at a front-end framework on any site that you want to be indexed by Google. The way we're going to be investigating these questions is the same as in our React review. We're going to be re-implementing the financial projector app that I built in Java way back when. It looks like this. And just see how easy it is and how hard it is to implement this application. Now, I chose this because it's a little more complex than your typical to-do app. It has a couple of major components here. We've got our configuration panel and our stock market projection, and these two have to communicate across the application, which can be a challenging aspect of user interface design. It also has a bit of an unusual architecture. We're using the whole value pattern from Ward Cunningham's checks pattern language, and the most notable thing about that is that all of our input is converted to a value object right away, and that value object handles invalid data so that we don't have to pop up any sort of dialogue. Instead, all of our calculations operate in the value objects, and they themselves know how to deal with adding together and multiplying invalid data. So that gives us this neat sort of spreadsheet-like display. There's a bit more of a domain layer to this application, a bit more complexity, and that is what we're going to be re-implementing. We're going to start out by just getting Angular up and running. I've got a simple sort of boilerplate application set up here. What we're going to do is just start by implementing a hello world, I think, in our basic page. Now I've got this set up with a really simple build script, so we can run this and see it come up locally here. But obviously there's nothing to do here yet, or nothing here yet, so we'll have to get that going. I think I'm going to start by just trying to get a hello world going. I'm going to go ahead and do that and be back in a moment. Okay, we've got a hello world up and running. Pretty straightforward here. It's just a matter of putting in the Angular script. Right now I'm just using the CDN version, although we do have a copy downloaded that I might use later. Be sure when you're using Angular to put in this ng app directive. It doesn't have to go on the HTML. It can go on any component. That just tells Angular where to hook in. And then I set it up with just regular HTML is what it looks like. What happens is Angular calls this a template. And what it does is when Angular loads, it will actually look at all of your HTML and start doing its magic. It will look for these special attributes and use them to determine how to run. And it will also look for these curly braces and determine what to substitute. Now, I assume, I haven't actually tried this, but I assume this means that if Angular doesn't load or if it's slow loading for some reason, then we'd end up with a very strange looking page. I suppose that's just part of the cost of using Angular. I imagine there's a way of dealing with it, but I haven't come across what that way might be yet. So here we have our simple program. If we load that up here, it does work. There we go. And you can see here Angular's famous two-way binding. One of Angular's real claims to fame is that you can very easily set up a text field like this input text field to bind to some aspect of your application. And what's happening here is under the covers, it's creating a model. And Angular, I did a fair amount of research into this before recording, and Angular has a lot of terminology. It just has a huge amount of terminology and a lot of special things that you sort of have to keep in mind. Let me just read these off to you. There's of course models, which is how we connect our data entry to our data output. There's scope, controllers, views, modules, services, directives, templates, and filters. And that's just in the basic AngularJS core components. And then there's also a large variety of additional components that you're going to want to use if you're really adopting Angular to its fullest. So it's a pretty big surface area, and that sort of gets to our question of accidental complexity. Is all this surface area really worth it? In contrast to React, which we did last time, React had a very narrow surface area. There was just a few things that you had to deal with as a developer, but it was very deep under that, and that it had a lot of sophistication to make that thin surface or narrow surface area work well. Angular, in contrast, has a very big surface area. It does do more than React. So it'll be interesting to see whether all these concepts that we have to learn in order to use Angular well are really worth it. So the next thing I think we're going to do here is let's start customizing this. Now, typically with Angular, what you're going to do is use a controller to determine how everything works. So this basic hello world is connecting directly in HTML. There's no JavaScript whatsoever here other than Angular itself, of course. But in a larger application, you're going to want to separate your JavaScript and your template, your HTML. So let's see if we can figure out how to make this hello world work with that. And the way you do that with Angular is a controller. So I'm going to go ahead and look into that. Be back in a few. Okay, getting a controller in here, it looks like what we need to do is introduce a script and also tell Angular that we're using a controller. And again, the controller is how you separate your JavaScript from your presentation, from your HTML, what Angular calls a template. Basically, if you want to put more complicated logic into your application, you're supposed to do that in a controller. Now, this idea of a controller and a model and a view was originally introduced in Smalltalk. The idea was that your view represents what you actually see. Your model represents the underlying data that is displayed in the view. And the controller, originally in Smalltalk, was your actual mouse or keyboard. It actually was an abstraction of your mouse and keyboard. And then a different version of MVC was popularized by Rails, but it was actually introduced in Java for ASP Model 2 architecture. And in this model, this is what most people think of nowadays when they think of MVC. The view was the HTML, the model was still the underlying data, and the controller was the code on the server that basically took input from the client and figured out what HTML to build. So Angular, when they're using this controller terminology, it's not really clear to me what they mean by controller. It doesn't look like a Smalltalk version of, hey, this represents the mouse. And it doesn't look like the Rails or Java ASP version or JSP version where it represents data coming in from the client. I think what they mean by controller here is just the JavaScript that underlies your HTML, and it's sort of your generic catch-all. At any rate, to get this set up, we need to apply, or to follow the pattern, we're going to apply a ng app here, and then we'll need to create a corresponding JavaScript script. So let me go ahead and do that. And this ng app, this corresponds to a module, I believe. So we'll want to say angular.module hello world. That needs to match. And I've noticed this throughout Angular is that you have strings that have to match up, and that's how you coordinate between these various files. And then we're going to pass in some information about what our controller expects here. This is Angular's famous dependency injection. They will automatically figure out what to pass into your module or various functions based on what you put here. Previous versions actually would just analyze your source code directly and pass it in. Of course, that didn't survive minification, so now they're using this syntax here. Let's see, and actually this doesn't need anything. We're not going to pass in anything to our module, but instead we'll do that for the controller. I'm going to try to make this my own a bit. Now I think if I do this, now that we've defined a module, I'm not sure what's going to happen with what we've done here. Let's go ahead and try that. Yeah, we've we've broken it because we've set up a module, but we haven't given it any controller. So I think Angular is looking for that controller and just giving up. Let's see if there's an error in here. Oh yeah, all kinds of stuff. And you know what? I don't think I've actually imported that script yet either. One thing I note is that this error is terrible. It's really bad. Let's see, if I take off the module name, everything works. If I put a module name on there, now it's working. Interesting. If I spell that module wrong, yeah. So this is what you get when you make a typo in your module name. That is really bad. Oh, but there is a URL here. Now this is much nicer. I have to say this is a great explanation of what's going on. Well, actually, no. It's a much better explanation than what you originally see here. I wonder if it's because we're using the minified version of Angular. Let me see if I can pull in the regular version. There we go. Perfect. Okay. So the issue is just that we're using the minified version. This is a lovely error message. You've either misspelled the module name or forgot to load it. That is perfect. I really like that. Very nice. Okay, let's go ahead and put this back. So interestingly, now that we have created a module named Hello World, and that is working, even though we don't have a controller set up on it. Let's go ahead and see about getting that controller going. And again, we're telling Angular what things we want to have passed into our controller. Okay, so we've set up our controller here, and what we're going to do inside of this controller is basically assign things to the scope. The scope, this is sort of a magical thing in Angular, and there's a fair amount of articles online about it because it can get complex. But at its most basic, it really is just your variables and your functions that you can use inside of your HTML template here. So if we set up our template, our HTML, to use our controller, and the way we do that is by specifying it here, and our controller is named Hello Controller, then what that means is that I believe it will look on the scope for these your name and another name variables. So if I run this, what happens? It still works. But now I should be able to put extra code in our model to create an additional piece that is constructed. And do I need to put parentheses on that if it's a function? I think I do. So let's see what happens if we do that. Yep, there we go. Okay, so what we have here is we've introduced a controller. That is just sort of the code that if we want to create code that operates on our HTML, we need a controller behind it as a place to keep that code. And in that controller, we can define scope. Scope is basically what we see or what gets put into these curly brace brackets and when we say ng model. So if I say that the model for this text field is first, then it will get put into a bit of scope called, it will be put into our scope as scope.first. Similarly, second will get put in as scope.second, and then we can pull them out here. And we can also call a function in our controller, which in this case we called constructed. We define that as scope.constructed, and we set it up to return first and second. So when we see that, they show up there in our constructed variable. It's very magical, and I'm not generally a big fan of magic because I find it difficult to figure out how my flow control is working. But now that I understand what's going on here, it seems like it would be pretty straightforward to use. However, there is sort of this very, very tight coupling between what we type into here and what we put into here. And if we make a typo in here, suddenly it's going to stop working without any errors. I'm not loving the tight coupling between the names that you use in your template and the names you have to use elsewhere in Angular. And we are seeing that over and over again with the hello world here, hello controller here, the various bits of things we put on our scope. Those all have to be exactly right in order for this to work. And they're in different files, so there's not real clear indication. It's not easy to do, it's not easy to see that they match because they are in different files. But now that we have a basic controller working here, I'm going to take a moment to see if there's other ways of approaching this question, and then we'll move on to getting our sample application mocked up. And just to remind you, our sample application is going to be the financial projector. What we're going to do this month in this episode is just get it mocked up. We're not going to actually put in any of the real domain model stuff or get it working. Just want to see how we could create something like this in Angular without necessarily having it all put together. All right, I'm going to go look at that and I'll be back in a moment. Before we move on, I want to show an alternative way of writing the controllers that was actually brought up in the live stream that I did when I was recording this. Thanks very much to Jones D for bringing this up. There is two ways that you can create controllers in Angular. One is the more common way is the way that you saw previously with the scope, but you can also set up a controller as just a normal JavaScript class. To do that, you pass in the name or the constructor of the controller here. And then you can just define prototypes or methods on that class as normal, and all of your binding happens as instance variables on that controller. So first and second become this dot first and this dot second. An interesting surprise here, as I was trying to figure this out. This only works if you use this specific syntax of ng controller. At least that's what it looks like to me so far. That's what I was able to figure out. If you don't say as hello, then the class style of controller will just simply fail, and fail silently, unfortunately. And this is an example of what I'm talking about when I say accidental complexity. Accidental complexity is hoops or confusion that a framework adds to your problem that has nothing to do with the problem that you're solving. So in our case, we're trying to do a very simple hello world app. And I spent a decent amount of time trying to figure out why my app stopped working when I went to this new style of controller. And part of it was just some dumb mistakes I was making, but part of it was also that I didn't realize, or I didn't know how this line here interacted with the style of controller I used in an entirely different file. These two things, the template and the controller, are really tightly coupled, but they're put in different files and they're linked through magic words, magic symbols, magic strings. So that's something that I'm not liking so far about Angular. There's a lot of this magic linking going on that you just sort of have to get right. And when you get it wrong, Angular will fail silently. It just stops working. Regardless, I'm going to go ahead and this $scope style is a little bit more common according to the documentation. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to that style. But I thought it was worth mentioning that there is this other way of making controllers, which I do find easier to read. But again, that's because I'm coming from a JavaScript background. I don't have a lot of familiarity with Angular. So I like this approach because it looks more like regular JavaScript. I'm going to go ahead and put this back to the scope style, and then we will start mocking up our financial projector application. Okay, I've put the controller back to the dependency injection style where we're taking our scope in. I do wonder if there's some obscure difference between this style and the as hello style that in terms of where your data is being put. When we inject the scope, the data is being put on a scope object that prototypally inherits from the parent scope. And with the as hello style, I'm wondering, I'm not entirely sure, but it seems like in the documentation that it's saying that we're now creating a new object called hello that goes onto the parent scope. It's not entirely clear to me what's going on there. I did notice, though, in my research into Angular that scope is probably one of the biggest sources of confusion people tend to have because they do inherit from each other and interact in potentially confusing ways. Anyway, now that we've got our basic hello controller back, I'm going to go ahead and start working on getting our financial projector app mocked up. This should be pretty straightforward. It's just a matter of getting all of the HTML in place to mimic this. And I've already done that for the React special. So I'm going to do that and be back in a moment. Okay, I've done a little mock-up of our financial projector app. This is all just hard-coded HTML. You can see it here in our HTML, our Angular template. Really straightforward, just exactly the same as it was in our React example with a configuration panel, stock market table, and then a bunch of hard-coded data. We do have the advantage this time, though. I've already got the CSS in place, so we've got a little bit nicer styling than we would typically have at this stage of the game. So now that we've got this in here, let's go ahead and just confirm that we know how to do the data binding on this. I'm going to make this starting balance connect to this starting balance in the table. If I understand Angular correctly, that should be really straightforward. We should be able to just say ng model equals, and then whatever we want. Let's call it starting balance. And then down here, I can replace this with starting balance, and that should work perfect. And it does. That was super easy. And next, I could even have it have a default by defining it here at 10,000. Very nice. Very nice. Yeah. I like that. Now that I'm starting to get familiar with some of the concepts in Angular, it's starting to go pretty smoothly. One of the things that people say about Angular is that it's made them immensely productive and cut way down on the amount of code they have to write. And I can see how you could feel that. And one thing I like about this is that it definitely feels like I'm working with normal HTML. And I know that was one of the design goals with Angular, is to feel like you had regular HTML that had just been pumped up a little bit. And that's very much what this feels like. Now, the magic connections between this word and this word still bug me a bit, and this one here. But I am liking how easy it was to set this up with an initial value and have that binding work. Now what I'd like to do is introduce a new concept in Angular, which is directives. This is basically how we create components in Angular. We can, rather than putting all of our HTML right here in our index, what we can do is we can actually, I believe, set up a component where I'd say something like configuration panel, and then put in configuration field with a starting balance. I think that is the way we can do this. And then, of course, our other fields, which was starting cost basis and yearly spending. So that is what I'm going to look at next. This is what we're going to try to accomplish. The way we do that is, as I said, creating a directive. And I think we can put those all right here in our example.js. I'm going to do that to start, and then we'll look at modularizing it later. So the first thing I want to do, I think, is just split this out into a single directive called configuration panel. And then from there, we'll look at creating the configuration fields. All right, to make a directive, it should just be a matter of saying module.directive and then putting in the name of the directive. And in this case, what we want is configuration panel. And then we'll pass in a function like this. That function needs to return an object that has a whole bunch of stuff in it. I'm just going to follow the example they have on their homepage. Restrict is tells it what kind of component it is. E in this case means HTML. I'm not sure why that is. Transclude says, can you put things inside of the component? Scope, just like this scope here, it says where are our variables going to go? And by creating an empty object here, what I'm doing is I'm saying I want an isolate scope. I want a scope for this configuration panel that's completely independent of the rest of the page. And that's handy when you're doing directives or components, because it lets you get away from some of the confusion that can happen when you have scopes inheriting from other scopes. And then, of course, the controller, which will take our scope. And in the example, they have it taking an element, which is the DOM element, I believe, that the panel corresponds to. We're probably not going to need that, but I'm going to put it in anyway. And then the template. And this is the actual HTML that the component is going to use. So in our case, I'm going to go ahead and just use this right here. Then after the template, replace, which just basically says, do we use the HTML that's in this template, or do we replace it with our new template? I'm not entirely sure how that works, but for us, because we're defining a configuration panel tag, I think we're going to want to replace it. And there we go. That should work. Now, we're not using it yet, so I don't think anything will happen when I refresh the page. No, it doesn't. But I didn't get any errors either, so hopefully that means that it was created successfully. So now I should be able to comment this out, and it goes away, and replace it with the configuration panel. I'm not sure if I've done that right. Let's see what happens. No, I didn't do it right. And again, Angular has not given us any error warning messages. So I definitely prefer my libraries and frameworks to fail fast. I guess it just doesn't recognize that tag, so it's ignoring it. Well, I'm going to go take a look at this. I'll be back in a few. Okay, I figured it out, and this was a tricky one. Thanks very much to Scott Corrigan from the live stream chat for figuring this out for me. What happens here is Angular does a little bit more of its magic, its name matching magic, which I am increasingly not a fan of, I have to say. What's happening here is that Angular will convert a name that's camel case to dashes. So this actually needs to be named, start with a lowercase c, and that will turn into configuration panel here, like that. And when we do that, it works. That's really interesting, and I do not like that. Not at all. Now, I wonder if I could use configuration dash panel here. No, that doesn't work either. You have to do that conversion if you want to use multiple words. That is not great. It really isn't. Okay, next I'm going to try to put together the configuration field directives. Now, we do have the ability to transclude, which means that we can put, since we've turned this transclude on here, we can use the ng transclude directive to put things inside of our template. So I've got foobar here, and that means it will show up as foobar right here. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a configuration field. So there's our field. The hard part is going to be getting this to fit into here, and then somehow we want to set up this starting balance. And I think we'll use the transclude for that. So if I do this, we've got our configuration field and our configuration panel. We should see starting balance show up twice here, and it does. Good. Now what I want to do is I want to actually put it here like this. So rather than hard coding the value here, I'm going to transclude it. So first, take it out. There, it's gone. And now we'll transclude it. And transclusion, again, is just a fancy way of saying take whatever's inside of the component tags and put it here where we say. So will this work? It does. Good. So now I should be able to do 3 of these by saying starting cost basis and yearly spending. And there we go. And in fact, looking at this, I don't know that we need a configuration panel. We might be better off just doing it right here in our core HTML template, our index.html. If we do that, there we go. So yeah, I think that's all we need for our configuration panel. We'll just do 3 configuration fields and then transclude in the name of the label. And that works really nicely. Restrict here, by the way, I did a little research on this while I was off camera. This E means that the configuration field can only be used as a tag. Now, if I were to take this out, it would still work because that is one of the defaults available to us. But if I changed it to, for example, an A, which means it can only be used as an attribute, then it would fail. But it fails silently, and I really dislike that. I would prefer that it failed fast and actually said something like, configuration field can only be used as an attribute. That just seems to be part of the Angular philosophy, though, that they would rather fail silently. They'd rather assume that you know what you're doing and not fail, and presumably have something else pick it up. I don't know how, than to fail fast. Anyway, now that we have our configuration field, I think we can start getting into our stock market table. And I think what I'll do is, again, rather than creating a stock market table directive, because we don't really need that, it doesn't add a whole lot, what I'll do is I'll just create the stock market table row. So what I'll do is I'll put in a stock market row here. I don't know if I like that idea or not. We'll try it. Anyway, creating this should be pretty easy. We'll make this a tag only. So in this case, we'll say restrict E. Transclude, I'll make false for now. Scope, again, we'll do an isolate scope. Controller, we don't need yet, but I'm going to put in for later. And then the template is all of this. Okay, now that we've got the template, next thing we need is replace. And again, that just tells us we are taking over the tag entirely. At its heart, it seems like Angular is really an HTML compiler because this directive stuff is actually documented in the compile piece of the Angular API documentation. At any rate, if we do that, there is our row, but it did not show up in the right place. Our TR has bounced out of the enclosing table. So there's a question. How do we get the rows to nest within another tag? I'm going to go look into that. Back in a few. Okay, after looking into this a bit, it appears that Angular won't let me use a tag name with a table row. Now, the answer here that I found on Stack Overflow said that it should work as long as we use replace true, but we are using that and it's still not working. So perhaps I'm missing something. But what we can do is, rather than making this a tag-based directive, we can make it an attribute directive like this, and then change our code here to just specify the table row like that. Then we put the attribute or the directive as an attribute. If we do that and we take out the table rows and we say that it's not going to replace it, then that should now work. And it does. So now I should be able to go back to our index and create multiple rows and see them all show up. And there they are. Okay, getting the stock market table directive was super simple. Just the same as before, we set it up to be a tag. We told it that we're not transcoding, we're not putting anything inside the stock market table. Set up an isolated scope and an empty controller just for the future. It's not strictly necessary, but this way I can remember how they work. And then just move the template code out of our index.html and into here. The main difference here with the stock market table is we did use a directive inside of a directive, and it worked just fine. There was no trouble whatsoever. It was all really smooth. So the last thing I'm going to do, I think I will go ahead and make a configuration panel, and then that will be it for directives. So I'll do that and be back in a moment. Okay, that's done. Another really easy case of making a directive. Again, we told it to be a tag. We told it there wasn't going to be anything inside of it. We set up an isolated scope and controller, even though we're not doing anything yet. And then we put in the template. There was one gotcha here, though, and that is that previously, for the stock market table, I was using a self-closing tag, basically this. It turns out Angular doesn't like that, but once again, it failed silently. There's no errors coming out. It just didn't work. It stopped processing the rest of our HTML. So that is something to keep in mind when you're using Angular, is just don't use self-closing tags. Now, again, there may be some config option somewhere that I'm not aware of, or some setup that I'm not doing properly, but it looks like the self-closing tags aren't an option. And that does it for directives. I think we've got everything componentized. We've got our configuration panel in a configuration panel directive, and then it has 3 configuration field directives. And the stock market table is in its own directive, and each row is similarly its own directive. This was, once I figured out some of the little gotchas, it was pretty straightforward. The biggest thing was figuring out, strangely enough, that stock market row camel case has to translate to stock market row with dashes, like we've done here for the stock market table and here for the stock market row. There are just some fiddly things that you have to remember with Angular. That is the kind of accidental complexity that I don't like in a framework, but overall it's going okay. The other thing that I'm noticing, though, is that when it fails, for example, if I misspell something or if I just get something wrong, it just fails. There's typically no error message. It just doesn't work. That all sort of ties into accidental complexity, and so far I'm not a fan of that aspect of Angular. But creating these components has been really nice. Next, what we're going to do is modularity. So let's go ahead and get started on that. When I say modularity, what I really mean is splitting an application out into multiple files, which of course we want to do. But Angular actually has their own conception of what a module is. Now, I prefer to use Browserify for modularity, but Angular doesn't know about Browserify, and it's not really built to work with Browserify. So I think our challenge here, or part of our challenge here, is going to be to figure out whether or not Browserify and Angular can work together. Now, I've done a little research and it looks like they can, but I haven't actually seen it in practice yet. So I think what I'm going to do here is first I'll start splitting things out the Angular way. I'll just put each of our various components, our directives, into their own file using Angular's built-in modularity approach. And then after we get that working, I'll come back and we'll see if we can get Browserify working as well. So the first thing I'm going to do here is just break this out into files and put them as raw script tags right here in our HTML. That seems like a small, simple step that we can get working pretty easily. So I'm going to go do that and be back in a moment. Okay, that was just about as straightforward as I expected it to be. What I've done is I've just split the files into multiple, but they're very straightforward. We've got our configuration panel. I did put them inside of an IFI, an immediately invoked function expression, but that is pretty much it. They are still using a global hello world variable, which I'm defining here. So I think what I'd like to do next is figure out how to get Angular not using globals. And I think I can do that by loading the module inside of the IFI. So I'm going to go ahead and take a quick look at that and be back in a moment. Okay, that was fairly straightforward. Now I've got it set up so Angular, I'm no longer polluting the global namespace with my hello world module. That, again, just relies on magic strings, as Angular tends to like to do. Here we are setting up the module, and then here in our other files, we can retrieve the module by calling angular.module again, but not passing in a second parameter. This is a bit, I don't really like the way they've done this because it's not clear, but this means create module, this means retrieve module. And that's a very small number of characters for a very big difference. But other than that, it works great. I can see now why sometimes people like to use an alternative syntax, which looks like this, where we basically string everything together in a fluent style, just so that it's more obvious that this is creating the module versus retrieving the module. So now that we've got that working and we have a decent amount of file split up, we still just have one module here. And we have to very carefully control the order in which we load things. Example has to come before configuration panel. If we put it afterwards and we reload, everything breaks because, well, we're loading our configuration panel, our stock market table, they're looking up this hello world module. That module doesn't exist. And we do get a nice error message as a result, telling us what happened, but it would sure be nice if we didn't have to have that sort of issue. And Angular does have a way of dealing with that. We should be able to say what our dependencies are, what our module dependencies are right here. So we should be able to say something like configuration panel and stock market table here. And then have this all work regardless of the order that we define things in. I'm going to go ahead and look into that and be back in a moment. Okay, properly modularizing this was really straightforward, and it's definitely cleaned up the code. In particular, what it's done is it's allowed me to load my script in any order. I can put the example.js right here in the middle. Everything still works. And the reason for that is because I've told Angular that hello world depends on configuration panel and stock market table. Now you can see here that once again we're using Angular's magic terms or magic strings to coordinate everything. I don't like that because it means that typo really messes things up, but at least in this case, Angular does fail fast and gives you a very nice error message. I do like Angular's error messages when they have them, which is not often enough in my opinion. So this refers to configuration panel and stock market table, and then here in configuration panel, I'm creating a new module. Remember, if we have a second parameter, this means create, not retrieve. And that just causes everything to work properly. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in Browserify automation, and then we'll try to figure out how to join the two worlds. Angular has its own way of handling dependencies and modules. Browserify has its other. This is an example of that opinionated architecture. I'd actually rather that Angular didn't have its own module scheme and let me just use my own. But hopefully we can mix them together. Anyway, I'm going to go get Browserify set up and be back in a few. I've got Browserify working. It was just a matter of bringing in my standard automation. Took a little bit of work, but no big deal. So now when I run my Jake, it will bundle everything with Browserify, build a deployment directory, which you can see here. We're now vendoring Angular, and everything loads just fine. There was one thing I had to do in order to make this work. By default, Browserify won't load any files except what you require. So in order to make Browserify actually load the configuration panel and the stock market table, I had to put them here. Of course, we don't want to have to manually require every file that we're using. That's sort of, I mean, there's no real point in using Browserify at that point. It's really a glorified concatenator. And Angular can be used with just a regular concatenator. We can use the Angular module system and then just bundle all the files by squashing them together and then minifying. But I would like to use Browserify because the app we're building, all the code which already exists, just using without the Angular UI on top of it, that all uses Browserify. So I do want them to play nicely together. And also, again, part of the criteria here, the review criteria, is to check how well Angular plays with others. Does Angular need to own the world? They've built their own module system, which again, I don't think was a great choice. But having done that, can they at least make it play nicely with something that's designed to be a module system, namely Browserify? So what I want to do now, so we have this requiring, what we need to do is somehow bring in the configuration panel and the stock market table, but somehow use require functions that look like they're actually returning a value. And I did some research on this before recording, and I found some interesting stuff by Ben Klinkenbeard, who has been working on this problem. And what he's come up with, basically the idea of requiring an Angular module and then referring to it by name, which actually I really like because it also gets rid of that annoying magic name problem that we have. So let's see if we can do that. Let's see if we can say that this is a configuration panel and put configuration panel here, configuration panel.name here. Now this won't work because we also need to export the configuration panel. So if I load this, my configuration panel blows up. We've got an error message here. Could not instantiate hello world because because we're trying to import undefined. But if we go into configuration panel module and we say that our module that we're exporting that module, then it might just work. And it does. Oh, excellent. Excellent, excellent. Well, that is fantastic. Let's go ahead and do the same thing for stock market table. Yes, my precious. All right, is that going to work? Looks promising. That is good. And if I change the name of the stock market table, now we don't have a magic string. It should still work. And it does. Excellent. And what if I break it here? That should result in a build failure. It does. Very, very good. And I think that does it for our modularity. We could tweak this, of course. We could inline this require statement, for example. I've seen examples of people doing that. I think that, again, was Ben Klinkenbeard who did that. But I think this is a little clunky in comparison to the way we were doing it. I mean, it's okay, but I'm going to go ahead and leave it the way we had it. That's sort of more my typical way of dealing with modules. This is okay. You know, I was concerned when I first saw that Angular had its whole own modular format. I was concerned that it was going to make life difficult. I still think it's kind of unnecessary, and I would rather that they just played well with any existing module framework, and maybe had some documentation about how to work with the popular ones like require.js, which is AMD, or with Browserify, which is CommonJS. But altogether, it was pretty painless. Getting this all to work together wasn't a big problem. Now that we have modules working, it's time to move on to testing. How do we test this code? Let's go ahead and take a look at that. The AngularJS documentation talks about two different ways of testing, and they're very gung-ho about testing, which of course I love. As you know, since this is Let's Code Test-Driven JavaScript, naturally I'm thrilled to see that they care deeply about testing. And the dependency injection that they have embedded throughout AngularJS is held up as sort of the testing is the reason that exists. That is the main reason that Angular is designed the way it is because they're so thrilled about testing, or that's how it comes across anyway. So they have a guide for unit testing and a guide for end-to-end testing. The unit testing is based on or is assumed to use Karma, which we have used before. If you're not familiar with Karma, check out this link right here for more information. So we'll go ahead and get that set up. And then in their documentation, they talk about dealing with controllers, but they don't say anything about how you would test a template. So I think we're going to want to look into that. Now, they also do a lot on end-to-end testing. They've built their own tool, which is kind of another example of them sort of doing everything their own way. But they've built a tool called Protractor for end-to-end testing. As far as I can tell, they've put a lot of work into this Protractor tool, and it seems to be their way of answering the question of how do you test the template? How do you test that the HTML is saying the right thing and responding to clicks correctly? The problem with that is that end-to-end testing is really a lousy approach to testing. I really try to avoid end-to-end testing wherever I can because it's very slow. It can be quite brittle. You can design your way around that, but it still can be pretty brittle and slow. And you can do anything that you can do with end-to-end testing, almost anything you can do in end-to-end testing, you can do better in a unit testing tool. It won't always be with unit tests. You might need to do focused integration tests, which are sort of like unit tests that talk to the outside world. But you can do those sorts of things in a unit testing tool, and it's faster and more reliable and more focused. So I'm probably not going to be looking at Protractor as we look at Angular. I'm going to see how much we can do just in unit tests. So the first thing that I'll need to do, of course, is get Karma up and running. I'm going to go ahead and do that and be back in a moment. Okay, I am back. That was way more painful than I wanted it to be. That took a lot of work. So I did my normal, just set up Karma with Mocha, expect.js, and common.js. That all worked fine, but it didn't work. And at first it was just my own dumb mistake. I didn't have Angular installed. But even after that, it didn't work. And the error message I got was really terrible. Let's see if I can find an old... Yeah, the error message I got was reference error, module is not defined. So I went down this huge rabbit hole of trying to figure out what was wrong with Karma common.js, which of course I assumed, since common.js is what has modules, that's where the error was. But no, that wasn't the issue. I'd forgotten that, of course, Angular redefines module and does its modules in its own way. I still don't know why it was doing that. What I do know is that Angular was running and failing before my test ever executed. And to fix it, I had to add this Angular mocks file, which unfortunately is not mentioned at all in their guide on unit testing. Thank goodness that there's a really nice document about testing with Angular.js from Ruben Wierschmerz. You can find that at this URL here. He goes through and describes the exact configuration needed to make Karma and Angular testing work together, and he had this Angular mocks in there. Without that, bizarro error. With it, everything's working just fine. So now we have a really nice set of automation where we're linting everything and running our tests on all these browsers here. Angular 1.3 has dropped support for IE8, so I'm not testing against IE8. I'm testing against IE8, 9, 11, 10, 11, Chrome, Safari, Firefox, and iOS. And that, of course, is the lovely thing about Karma, is it gives you the ability to test against real browsers. Now that we've got all that working, it's time to get a real test running. Right now, I've just got a do nothing test. What I'd like to do is just figure out how we can do some basic testing. And then next month, when we continue building out our sample application and get into architecture and design, we'll do more sophisticated testing. But today, in this episode, what I'd really like to do is just figure out how to do testing. So I think I will try to test, just the simple stock market row and see if we can assert that the template contains this starting balance. Now, I'm not exactly sure how to do this. I think the first thing we're going to need to do is just somehow get a hold of this directive. I don't think that's going to be too hard. I'm going to take a quick look at how to do that and be back in a moment. All right, looking at the documentation here, it looks like the question of how we get the directive is an interesting one because Angular kind of runs everything globally. Angular doesn't have a concept of modules in the modern sense like we have with Browserify. Instead, it assumes that everything has been loaded globally, and then it uses its own module systems to sort of dereference that global namespace. So rather than loading our directive, what we need to do is load the module, and then the directive will just sort of magically appear, and we should be able to compile it. So let's go ahead and try that. We're going to load the module using this before each, and then we'll need to get some services in, and then we can use them. Let's see what happens with that. This has been a little frustrating. I have not been able to get Angular to work with the require statement, but what's interesting is that if I just load the module, it does work. It works fine. If I load it by its magic string, and if I put in the wrong magic string, it fails. So I do know that that is working. But why doesn't require work? I don't know. Let's go ahead and continue on using this that we know works, and we'll get the test working further, and then I'll come back and look at this question of how require is supposed to work. If we look at our example, we should be able to call compile on our directive, tell it to digest, that way it actually compiles it, and then confirm that the element has what we want. Now, in order to do that, we will need our compile service and our root scope service, which we can get Angular to inject to us by using inject. So let's go ahead and try that. In another bit of magic, you might consider this to be convenient, you might consider it to be obscure magic. I'm leaning more towards the latter. What happens here is Angular figures out which services you want by their names. It actually does a toString on the function, looks at the function call, and then pulls these out, which, yeah. If they have underscores around them, then it ignores the underscores, but only if the underscores are exactly right. You have to have one on each side. If you have two on each side, no go. Thou shalt have one and one on each side only. Thou shalt not have two or one on one side and not on the other. Only one on each side. And if you do that, then you can do this convenient thing of copying them into your variables like this. And we should expect that these are defined. And there we go. So we have our compile service injected, and presumably we have the same thing with our root scope service. Yes, we do. So now that we have that, we should be able to compile our directive down into an element. We'll expect that element to be okay. So far, so good. Now let's dump out the element HTML. At this point, because we haven't digested it, I would expect it to still say stock market row. But in fact, it's just flat out nothing. That should be okay. We should be able to say rootscope.digest. But hopefully, running digest works, but it didn't. Okay, well, I'm going to look into this, be back in a moment. Oh my God. It has been hours, and I mean hours since I started working on this problem, and I've run into pretty much everything I hate about frameworks in the process. Remember my review criteria? They're lock-in, opinionated architecture, accidental complexity, and then testing and search engine compatibility. This was both a problem of accidental complexity and of opinionated architecture. Fundamentally, what's happening here is that Angular isn't finding our stock market row directive, and so it's just dumping out nothing. If rather than dumping out just the HTML, we also dump out the element, you can see that we are just getting stock market row. What I've done is I've encapsulated it in a div so we can see what's inside there. That means that Angular isn't translating it. And unfortunately, Angular is designed to fail silently instead of failing fast. So when it finds a directive, which is just an HTML tag that it doesn't recognize, it just ignores it, which is really, really not a great design choice. I understand why they did it. They did it because they're using real HTML files for their templates, and they don't want Angular to break when HTML comes along and something new comes along in HTML that Angular doesn't support. That's laudable. But this failing silently is a real tough one, because it would have been nice for Angular to tell me what it was seeing. Ultimately, what's happening here is that there's a complex interaction between Angular and the Angular mocks library that we had to add in for our tests. Angular mocks adds a couple of globally available functions, specifically inject and module. Inject is what we're using right here. Now, when I looked up the example of how to do this, it said that I wanted to run it like this: before each module, and then the module name, which in this case is stock market table. I saw that little bit of code and I thought, I don't like having two before eaches. I'll just go ahead and put it in my inject or down here in this before each. So I did. Seems like a reasonable change, right? Well, that's where the accidental complexity comes in. It's accidental complexity because this function right here does something very special that's not really obvious when you look at it. It looks just like angular.module, but it's not. What this is doing is loading the Angular module. It's returning a function that will load the Angular module and manipulate it so that it works along in a test environment. That's part one of the problem. Part two of the problem is that when we did this, we got this error, object is not a function. This is where the opinionated architecture comes in. Angular has its own understanding of what module is, but in CommonJS, with Browserify and the CommonJS bridge, module is defined around every file. It's the CommonJS module. So Angular's global module variable has been overwritten by the CommonJS module. So what we really need to do here is say angular.mocks.module so that we're not using the global. It's another example of Angular's magic. Angular really tries to make everything easy, but it does that at the cost of making things really hard to understand and especially hard to figure out when they break. So when we do this, everything should work, right? Well, no, it still doesn't work because remember, module returns a function. It doesn't run, it returns a function. It says injector already created cannot register a module. So that sort of peculiar design decision that they had in the example of saying angular.mock.module, although it wasn't documented why you need to do that, what this does is this forces this function to run before this function, and this ordering is very specific. Now, I'm glad they failed fast in this case. So when I came along and I took module out and said it needs to go in here, I was compounding error on error on error. Now, when I run this, everything should work, right? Well, no, actually, it still doesn't work. Now, of course, as I was trying to troubleshoot this, I didn't know what was really going on. So I'd try something and it wouldn't work. So I'd put it back and try something else. It makes sense to try just one thing at a time. But because there were a lot of things going wrong simultaneously, it was extremely difficult for me to figure this out. I actually, in the end, I did figure it out by starting over. I started a whole new project and followed the example step by step by step to reproduce it and make it work. And then I mutated it, modified it little by little until it matched this example to see where it failed. So this still doesn't work, and that's because stock market row does not work as a standalone entity. It has to actually be put in as a directive on the TR tag. That was something we decided to do earlier and I forgot about. And we've set up the directive to be restricted so that it only runs as an attribute, which would be great if it fails fast, but it doesn't. So when we didn't use stock market row as an attribute, Angular saw stock market row. I presume it looked up the directive. It saw that it's not allowed to be used as a tag. It has to be used as an attribute, and it just ignored it. So the correct way to do this would be to wrap this in a table, tr with a stock market row directive, tr and table. And when we do that, finally, everything works. I can't express how much I hate that I had to go through this. It took me hours and hours and hours. It was really, really hard. And I think it reflects some fundamental flaws in Angular. Now, admittedly, this was my misunderstanding of how Angular is working, but Angular didn't do anything to help me. In fact, Angular's design, I think, encouraged the problems that I was having. It's possible to design your code to encourage problems or to encourage problems to be solved. And in this case, I feel like Angular was designed to create problems rather than help solve them. Regardless, it is working now. What we can do is we can say that we expect the element HTML to equal what? Well, this. T-body, blah, 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 blah. And now if we do that, our test should pass. They didn't though, and that's surprising. They worked on Safari and Chrome, but not on Firefox or IE. And this is the advantage of using Karma. It does allow you to run on all these browsers, but I have to say I was not expecting this to fail in this way. I'm going to go check this out. I'll be back in a moment. All right, the error here is a little bit tricky. What's happening is that Firefox and IE are rendering out differently, or they're rendering attributes in a different order than Chrome and Safari. So when I grabbed that HTML to paste in my comparison, it wasn't exact. Now that's not a big deal. Directly comparing HTML strings is not great form anyway. The problem here though is that there's not a lot in Angular for comparing directives. Really everything, what you get back from doing this compile. Earlier I said that the digest was what compiled it, but no, compile turns this into HTML, and then the digest calculates any double brace calculations you might have, which we haven't really used much yet. But if I had, for example, starting amount here, then compile would return all of this with starting amount in here, and then digest would substitute out the starting amount. At any rate, it's not great form comparing static strings like this, static HTML strings. The problem is that I don't see any way, from looking through the Angular documentation, I don't see any way of doing anything else. Compile returns a JQLite element, which is sort of a re-implementation of jQuery, a subset of jQuery. So we have things like HTML, and we can do other jQuery-like things on it. Notably missing, though, is anything about seeing whether or not there's directives or something else. So in order to test this, our only options are to dig into the HTML, which has been all marked up with these attributes, and those are not predictable. So I'm not sure how I want to deal with this yet. I think in this case, so we just can't render it out as pure HTML because of the attributes that Angular adds. I think in this case, what we're really testing is that this starting balance comes through properly. So let's go ahead and test that. We'll just write a test. We can't do the renders as HTML test. But what we can do is we can say it substitutes the starting balance. So that will be basically the same exact code in that we'll compile the element. We'll digest it, because remember, you have to call digest in order to get these curly braces to be translated. And then rather than looking at all the HTML, now what we can do is we can find the table data element that we want. So these are going to be our cells. And let's go ahead and just dump that out and see what we get. That should be an array of all of our cells, and we should be able to get the second one and see what's in it. Yeah, there's all of our cells. So the one we care about is the second one, 0 indexed. So this is our starting balance cell. And we'll expect the text inside, well, let's go with HTML to begin with. The HTML inside of our starting balance cell to equal, well, some value. We'll just say 9876 for now. Actually, it doesn't at all. So here, rather than getting the index, we will just ask for the jQuery element at index 1. If we do that, we're getting nothing out. And that's because we're not setting up our starting balance. Our starting balance is here as curly braces. We need to set it up in our scope. Let's do this. Let's define it here. So scope.startingBalance equals foo. And if I've done that right, then our test should say that foo equals 9876. Excellent. So now the question is, how do we want to get our data into this stock market row? I think that's a question we can save for next episode, because what we're trying to do here is just figure out how to test it. And that we have just about figured out. So I think for now, I'm just going to hard code this to 9876, and that should cause our test to pass. On everything except for IE9, it looks like. Okay, I've looked into this further. It feels like I am constantly trying to fight with AngularJS to get it to work the way I want. And that, if that's not just my own incompetence, which I'm not saying it isn't, but if it's not my own incompetence, then that is another example of accidental complexity. That's what you see with systems that have a lot of accidental complexity. You spend your time fighting the system rather than working on your work. And in this case, it looks like what's going on is the code just doesn't work on IE9. We're getting the same error out of IE9 when we look at the financial projections as we actually get on our tests, which is good in a way because that demonstrates that our tests are telling us something useful and valuable. Now, thanks to Jones D in the chat of the live stream when I recorded this, it looks like what's happening here is that Angular is inserting our stock market row directive and somehow trying to modify these values by changing inner HTML, which is read-only on IE. So what we need to do is somehow, I'm thinking, set the entire table row rather than just an individual table body or table cell. And the way you do that in Angular is by making this a TR and then using the replace option. So that's saying that we're going to replace the directive, the element that has the directive, with the template. Now, the problem with this is that this replace option has been deprecated. They say in the documentation, you shouldn't need it, which is all well and good, except we do in this case. And furthermore, we still have to use TR here, I believe. We've done this without TR, and that caused other browsers to get confused. And I think what we're seeing here is a fundamental flaw in Angular's architecture. Again, the fact that they're using the DOM as their template and inserting all kinds of stuff that the browsers don't recognize in there, especially when you're dealing with tables, that is just messy. It's just flat out messy, and it confuses the browsers. At any rate, though, I think this will fix it. Let's go ahead and try to look at IE9. Yep, that works there. And let's also try running our tests. Yeah, and now they're working. Well, there we have a basic test. I'm really not thrilled with this test. It is a starting point, but I don't think we're done yet. However, this has been a pretty long episode already, so I think we'll stop here. In next month's episode, we will look at design and architecture, and we'll also dig into the testing question more thoroughly, specifically around things like events and whether or not there is a better way of getting at what's happening inside of our directives. Now, there is another aspect to testing that we haven't gotten into. That is the idea that because of Angular's dependency injection, it's very easy to test controllers. That does look to be true, but it's also not very interesting. You can do that pretty much in any framework just by using an object and passing objects through, unless the framework somehow makes that deliberately difficult. Angular's use of controllers, which is all about testing, in my mind is not really the interesting problem. The interesting problem is how you respond to events and how you render your results out into your HTML. You need a way to test that because Angular fails silently. And you can get things like we saw here with IE9 failing and none of the other browsers failing. So you really have to test the templates. That's the hard thing in any environment, is testing what actually comes out in HTML. Testing calculations is and has always been easy and also not very interesting. It's very simple to segregate those out. And the fact that Angular makes that part of the framework is nice, but is not the important thing when it comes to testing browser behavior. So to wrap up, what we've done today in this episode is we've gotten Angular set up and running. We've made modularity work. So we've got our example application split out into multiple modules, and we've gotten some basic tests in place. Now, our criteria here, if you'll recall, was lock-in, opinionated architecture, accidental complexity, testability, and search engine compatibility. We haven't looked at search engine compatibility at all, but I am starting to get a sense of the other attributes. And I have to say, I'm not really thrilled with what Angular is providing so far. Lock-in is strong. What you do in Angular is stuck in Angular, and that's not too unusual. All the front-end frameworks I know of are like that, but it's not a point in favor of Angular. Opinionated architecture, yeah, it is a very opinionated framework, and they have a lot of their own terminology where they're actually redefining terms that are in common use elsewhere, like the way they do modules. The Angular architecture, its opinionated architecture, caused us a huge amount of trouble when it came to doing our tests in CommonJS because the names were conflicting. So I would say that's a strike against Angular. Accidental complexity, also not great. There is a ton of complexity in Angular. A lot of it feels like stuff that the people who made Angular have thrust upon me rather than that is essential to the problem. I feel like Angular is making my life difficult and forcing me to think about how Angular works rather than thinking about my problem at hand, which is a stock market projection. So on the accidental complexity front, not so good. And testability, our early view of testability, also not positive. It's all about the HTML. But what I want to do is I want to talk about a stock market table or a stock market row, or eventually the way our configuration panel and stock market table interact. But Angular's tests have me thinking solely in terms of HTML. So that's not so positive either. So very preliminary results on Angular. I am not thrilled with it. But it is very popular, and we haven't dug into it much. We've just been doing a lot of configuration, which is always the hard part. So next month, we are going to continue on with this. We will finish getting our example application up and running and really take a deep look at how Angular works with design and architecture. Thanks very much for joining me, everyone, and I will catch you next time.